You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. I am Naseem Ahmed and I will be your host for today's podcast. Is Israel in a death spiral? That's the question we'll be asking in our discussion today. Since 7 October, Israel's image has taken a massive blow across the globe. Its economy is tanking and its own officials are warning that the country faces an existential threat. Not from the outside, but one that is of its own making. And we can go on and list many other reasons why Israel is facing the threat of collapse. Last week at the University of Beirut, Sharmine Narwani delivered an amazing presentation on that very subject. It was titled Asymmetrical Warfare, How to Boil the Israeli Frog. It was, to me, a fascinating presentation, and I wanted to invite Sharmine on here to discuss her presentation at the American University of Beirut. Welcome to the show, Sharmine, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, very happy to be here, Naseem. Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you. Sharmine is a Beirut and UK-based writer and analyst of West Asian geopolitics and a columnist at The Cradle. Her work has been published in a broad array of media outlets, including the American Conservative, the New York Times, USA Today, The Guardian, Al-Akhbar English, many other mainstream and alternative news agencies. So in your presentation, Sharmine, you use the parable of a boiling frog to illustrate how Israel is facing slow but steady pressure from various fronts. So could you explain this concept and how it applies to Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, this is an old parable that basically tells the story of how if you put a frog in boiling water and raise the temperature 1 degree at a time so that the frog acclimates, you can boil the frog before it's even realized these temperature changes are fatal. So this is essentially not so much about the Gaza war, but the regional reaction by West Asia's axis of resistance to Israel. Many people have called for a fast, hot war against Israel, using the collective missiles and capabilities of this axis. But in fact, they have a strategy which is an asymmetrical or irregular warfare strategy, and I think best suited to the Axis because the Axis consists of only 2 states, and the rest of them are non-state actors. So Israel is is qualitatively the most advanced military in the region. So the Axis strategy is to incrementally raise the temperature on Israel to make it back down from its brutal military assault on Gaza, change its behaviors, and suffer consequences, which it is in a broad array of ways. And in my lecture, I had outlined some key ones, which were in the economic, political, military, and societal areas.
We'll get to those areas. So that discussion, of course, as you mentioned, came within the context of, is Iran going to respond to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh? Why isn't it responding? What would be the nature of its response? But what would you say to those who will say, but Iran did respond to the assassination back in, I think it was April, sorry, and it responded by hitting Israeli targets. So Iran is ready for all-out strikes if it's required to do so. So does that not kind of undermine the fact that Iran is trying to slowly boil the Israeli frog, because it has shown that it is capable, it is willing to launch military strikes on Israel?
Well, Iran's strike on Israel on April 13th and 14th was a retaliation for the Israel's violation of Iran's territorial integrity, because Israel struck the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing a dozen or so people. An embassy, a consulate, is sovereign territory of a state. And so Iran was not going to let that sly move go unanswered. And it retaliated for various reasons. One, to draw a line, to set the red line, not just in words, but to make it clear that you can't do that again. Israel had also, been targeting Iranian IRGC officers for quite a while in Syria, and this was too severe a violation of international law and conventions for Iran not to respond. When it responded, it did so in a way to showcase some of its military capabilities, because nobody'd seen this from Iran, just plain haven't seen it. We didn't have social media during the Iran-Iraq war, and Iran was in a much different position then. It had no missiles, and now it has the most extensive homegrown domestic missile program in the entirety of West Asia. So it was the opportunity to showcase what Iran could and would do. It was calculated in that Iran, like its partners and allies in the resistance axis, try to minimize civilian death and try to strike targets that have a strategic objective. Okay, so by striking that target, you will deter the enemy, or you will make clear that these are your red lines, or you will make clear set new rules of engagement. But in addition, what Iran did during the retaliatory strike was collect the widest array possible of military intelligence on where Israel and its allies would use their air defense systems. Okay, Iran is fully mapped an Israeli allied response, from which countries they would base themselves in, from which countries their fighter jets would launch, from which countries drones would launch. Was Turkey going to allow it? Was Saudi Arabia going to allow it? Was Qatar going to allow it? These were essential questions, and they were well answered that night. At a low cost to Iran, very, very high cost to Israel.
Almost like a war game. I mean, without the escalation, and the fact that it hasn't escalated as many probably thought. Probably Iran has achieved its goal from that point of view. In your presentation, also you mentioned how why Gaza is so different to many of the other wars. That Israel is not capable of fighting a long attritional war with any actor. Forget Hamas, any actor for that matter. All of its previous wars have been very swift and short, from 1948, 67, 73, and all the other, what they call mowing the lawn on Gaza. They've all been quite short. So what makes Israel such, so weak and unable to fight long, drawn-out attritional warfare? Why isn't it able to do that?
Israel has the mentality of the Americans, which is overpowering the enemy very destructively. So you carpet bomb areas, right? You need munitions for that, and in order you can do it for a few weeks, and then you run out of stock. And as the Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah mentioned in one of his earlier speeches after October 7th, he said that in the first month, Israel ran out of stock, and it has been getting shipments from the US and other allies ever since. So this, and we know today that Israel has received just from the United States 50,000 tons of weapons, hardware, military armaments, right? We know that every single day, airplane loads are flown in of US military equipment and munitions for the Israelis, as well as shipments by ship. So that's just from one country. So the Israel did experience this in its 2006 war with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, where it was running out of munitions. It had to stop the war. It lasted 33 days, which was extraordinary at the time. So, the Americans and other Israeli allies have kept stockpiles in Israel. So Israel is also running those down to nothing, as well as getting these shipments. The other reason is Israel's a small country. It's got a population of, I'm
million.
thinking like 7 million.
Oh, yeah, 10, yeah. I think 10
7?
million. 10 million probably
Is it
close.
10 million?
Yeah, 10
Well,
million, yeah.
okay, including the Arab population,
Yeah.
1948 Arabs, Palestinians, etc. So you don't have enough people in your army. You don't have enough reservists to call on. Then what's extraordinary about this particular situation is not only has it been unable to defeat its adversary, its non-state actor adversary, who makes munitions underground in this tiny strip of land, Gaza. Okay, but Israel has taken its confrontations to its northern border. It's just in the last few weeks expanded military operations and opened a new front in the West Bank, with some Israeli officials saying it's time we declare war, make it official. It's bombing Yemen. It's striking at Syria nonstop. Over 100 strikes since October 7th on just Syria alone. So it's incapable of doing this. Now, Israel has, since its origin, since David Ben-Gurion, had a military strategy that it is stuck by, which is short, hard wars, because it understands its vulnerabilities if these wars are not contained and executed very quickly. And this is genuinely the first time we're seeing Israel in a war of attrition to this extent, and not just on one front, on multiple fronts. There's, if Israel doesn't sign a ceasefire agreement over Gaza, things are just going to escalate on all these fronts. It's not capable of executing this war by itself. From day one, you had U.S. aircraft carriers move into the region, move into the Mediterranean to do a show of force behind Israel, right? But just today, the Pentagon announced it was withdrawing its 2 aircraft carriers from the region, which, in my view, is a real smack at Israel, saying you're on your own. The way you're acting, the way you're refusing to agree to a ceasefire agreement that your friends are insisting on, means your escalations are not palatable to us anymore. We're not going to be drawn into this. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens, especially with the U.S. election nearing, and pro-Israel rhetoric being something that both parties, we can expect to see from both parties' officials.
And we were talking earlier about the population figures. Of course, Israel does some 2 million Palestinians in Israel, something like that. And it's interesting that, of course, they have not supported this genocide, and they are not protesting in the way Arabs are, because they understand the situation there. And that could be another front. So there's a lot of weaknesses within Israel, not just demographically, but there are also, you touched on that, Israel itself, there are flaws in its very structure from its creation. The 2 pillars upon which it rests, which are being slowly weakened and undermined, and in the long term could see its collapse. And then those 2 weaknesses you mentioned are the myths of Israel, and also the aliyah, the Jews coming to Israel. And aliyah, of course, is based on the assumption that Jews will be safer in Israel than anywhere else in the world. And if anything, over the last year, we have seen Jews are the least safe in Israel than anywhere else. So there's a couple of myths that is being undermined here. So do you want to just quickly talk about those two pillars of Israel's
Yeah, I talk
existence?
I talk about them as Israel's two legs. It only has two legs. Yes, you can add perhaps a third leg, which is U.S. unconditional support. But that's not really a basis for the state. The two foundational legs of Israel are, one, the myths and the fairy tales, spinning their story, their narrative into one of perpetual victimhood, so that they garner the sympathy of the world, and to paint their enemies as violent, savage, barbaric, and warmongering. So that people will understand Israel's vulnerabilities and want to help the state. We are seeing the reverse happen now. Everyone understands that the Palestinians are the victims and that Israel is barbaric, savage, violent warmonger. So the myths and fairy tales have dissipated over 11 months very clearly. And, as I mentioned in my presentation, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic majority leader in the Senate, U.S. Senate, has said months ago in testimony to Congress that if Israel can't survive if it becomes a pariah. So we understand this to be true. So it really rested on this one leg of myths and fairy tales. The other leg, as you elaborated, is Jews moving to Israel. Without Jews moving there, there's no Jewish state. Now we have hundreds of thousands of Jews leaving the state, and more Jews than ever, Israeli Jews, applying for foreign passports than ever before. Not only are we seeing reverse aliyah, but all aliyah to Israel has stopped. Except for absolute crazy extremists who want to come in and fight Arabs and settle in the West Bank, but those are few. So in fact, both of Israel's legs have been broken, and therefore the foundation of the state has now been remarkably eroded.
Mm. Well, you mentioned Chuck Schumer. I actually wrote a piece on the back of his comment, when he said Israel cannot survive as a pariah. There are many pariah countries in the system, in the world.
Yeah.
You've got North
Yeah.
Korea, you've got Iran, you've got Russia, China is also pariah to some extent. Many pariah
By
countries.
Western standards, pariah. Let's make that clear.
Yes, right. Yes, by Western standards. But the point is, why do they still thrive? Why do they still continue? Iran is still strong despite the sanctions, despite trying to throttle its economy for decades and decades. Iran's survived. What is it about Israel that if it becomes a pariah, boom, it's gone? And then that's something that struck me. And I thought, those countries like Iran, like Russia, many others we might want to describe as from the axis of resistance. They actually developed what this Lebanese economist, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, said, described as anti-fragility. He's not talking about countries, but he's talking about companies. That some companies develop this anti-fragile quality to be able to thrive and grow despite, strong opposition. Israel doesn't have that.
Here's a surprise for you. Iran, Russia, Korea, China, they're real states. They have, some of them have thousands of years of contiguous population of the same ethnicity, the same language, essentially, same culture. Israel is a complete construct. It imported its populations, it imported its culture, it imported its system of governance. It's not indigenous to the region at all. Those are fragile states. Whatever you do to Iran, whatever you do to Lebanon, they will continue. They've been here for centuries and centuries and centuries with essentially the same ethnic and linguistic and cultural makeup. So, I mean, like I said, Israel's just it's a colonial construct, and like all other colonial projects, that haven't eliminated in their entirety their natural, indigenous populations, it's destined to fail. It's just a matter of when, not if.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, the level of indoctrination that would be required in collectively in collective indoctrination is not equivalent. I mean, if you look at Iran or Russia or many of the other countries, these are people who are there who will do anything to survive. Whereas Israel, you have a whole Jewish diaspora who have to believe in this idea of creating this safe haven for Jews, when many Jews in America will feel, hey, I'm safer here than I am in Israel.
Yeah.
Why do I have to believe in the
I mean, Israel's more a political idea, than a geographical one. I mean, the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, they looked at Argentina and they looked at other places in the world as a potential. There's nothing, specific. It's just a political movement. Okay. Whereas, and I think the fact that people who live in Israel are not all equals is also something that has kept the state fragile and in danger and insecure from its inception. Whereas in all these other countries, people are essentially under their constitutions equal.
That's right. Israel is not a state of all its citizens. It's a state for the Jews. Let's move on to some of the practical examples you highlighted of this collapse from the economic point of view, social and military point of view. So you touched on a number of key facts from the last 10, 11 months now to show how all the signs that Israel is on a path towards collapse are there, economically, politically, socially. Do you want to just run through some of those indicators?
I mean, I'll just say there was so much data. I had to excise a considerable amount from the presentation, and yet it still dragged on, So, for instance, on the military front, Moody, which does risk assessments for the economic and financial conditions of countries, it said back like in November 2023, a month after the war started, that the war is costing Israel $269 million daily, which, if it hasn't increased since then, would make it, and that's like unlikely, it would make the cost of the Israeli economy already over $80 billion today in 11 months. Out of, just in terms of what I said about its munitions, that Israel is out of munitions. It receives most of its munitions, or all of them really, from allied states who are under considerable pressure to stop these transfers. What it has, for instance, it has 2,200 tanks in its inventory, and a quarter of them have been damaged in just the Gaza Strip since the start of the war last October. Hundreds and hundreds of Israeli troops have been killed in combat. The official Israeli figures are around 700, but we believe that number to be much higher. And, over 10,000 Israeli active duty soldiers and reservists have been severely injured during this war. And I said, the state has a small population, and it's running through them. But out of these 10,000, which I also believe is low, you have a third that are suffering from severe mental disorders, and a full third that are missing. So we're talking like over 3,000 who are missing entire limbs. They believe a study was done in Israel that the cost to the Israeli economy just from the war trauma is going to be $50 billion over the next 5 years, which is an obscene cost. A lot of its allies that are supplying Israel with military equipment, countries such as Belgium, Spain, the Netherlands, Norway, even the UK have announced restrictions or complete halts to arms sales, and that pressure continues to mount in these countries, and we're starting to see litigation emerge. to really tie the hands of these states in supplying Israel. In terms of, I guess, the political sphere, which is domestic as well as diplomatic, international political sphere, 75% of Israelis believe that their government's performance in Gaza has been poor, and the handling of the war in the north on the Lebanese border is poor. The majority of Israelis favor early elections. The vast majority, 3/4, don't trust their government. This, of course, we saw before the events of October 7th, where there was a big groundswell of dissent in Israel that we saw through mass protests, etc., against Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial reform, which would place less power in law and more power in his extremist cabinet's hands. So that kind of distrust in the government continues. We've seen the last few elections been very hard to cobble together coalition governments, and they've fallen very rapidly. Within Israel, you have secular versus religious versus extremist factions, and there are so many events that have been triggered and will continue to be triggered by those divisions inside Israel. Also, 46% of Israelis fear the possibility of civil war. So that's a sense of the insecurity that's almost half of Israelis fear there will be a civil war. And they're not talking about the war in Gaza and the war in the north and the war in the West Bank. They're talking about a civil war among Israeli Jews. So their perception of domestic security has declined significantly. On the international political front or diplomatic front, a number of countries have either cut ties or recalled ambassadors from Israel. They occur mostly in the global south, but importantly, not just against Israel, but pro-Palestine efforts have been stepped up globally. And the state of Palestine is now recognized by 146 countries around the world. We heard a lot about Norway, Spain, Ireland joining this growing group, but there are other countries as well. And in May this year, 143 of 193 members of the UN General Assembly voted in favor of Palestine joining the UN. The UN is absolutely absorbed the number of resolutions that have been passed on one single state, Israel. I think it's 14 out of 21 UN General Assembly resolutions passed in 2023 were on the single country. Global image, of course, we're seeing across the world majorities turning against Israel and putting pressure on their governments to do the same. But importantly, in the US, which is Israel's irreplaceable, unconditional ally, 46% of young Americans in a poll conducted just this summer supported Hamas against Israel. So, there's a lot happening there. On the economic front, there are too many numbers to count. The Israeli economy shrank from 60% from 2022. Sorry, its economic growth went from like 6.5% in 2022 to like 2% in 2023. External investment in the state declined by 70%. And just in the last quarter of last year, the Israeli economy contracted by almost 20%. There are a lot of numbers on this. Agriculture land,
major ports closing. Major ports.
Eilat has declared bankruptcy. It was a strategic port that brought Red Sea shipments to Israel. Israel gets 80% of its imports via sea, so this is a significant thing. But even its two other major ports, Ashdod and Haifa, which were once hubs for people bringing vessels, unloading, and reshipping elsewhere, has virtually, has become nothing. Lots of international contracts voided. The ones we're familiar with are the big Intel $25 billion contract without Intel explaining why. publicly, foreign investment funds, retirement funds, university funds pulling out of Israel. So, their exports have plummeted, their imports have plummeted, they're only getting their stuff through sneaky ways via, unfortunately, Egypt and Turkey, major exporters to Israel, under under the radar as much as they can be, despite their public comments. And the routes to ship to Israel have significantly declined, with Yemen's Ansar Allah movement blockading the Red Sea, Gulf of Oman, moved into the Indian Ocean to stop the long route around the tip of Africa and back up to the Mediterranean, and has now opened a Mediterranean front. So, one example I gave in my presentation was that for, insurance, therefore, on shipments has also been, gone up significantly. So a fuel tanker day rate from West Asia to the Netherlands jumped from $23,000 per day in December to $73,000 per day in January, just 1 month. So that's, the economic front. On the societal, we kind of went over it. 250,000 Israelis have been evacuated from their homes in the north and the south. The number of Israeli Jews leaving the country quadrupled between October and this June, with around 500,000 departing, applying for second passports, and the insecurity. Only 8.5% of Israelis believe that Israel's war goals will be achieved completely.
Mm. And to add to that, I mean, I think you mentioned that in the presentation as well, the conscription of the Hasidic Jews, the religious Jews.
Yeah.
There was almost like a social contract between the religious Jews and the state of Israel that, you let us study our Torah, and we won't oppose the state.
No, we'll grow your Jewish numbers. They have a lot of babies.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but ultimately, for them, the state is not the key issue. For them, being in the Holy Land, so and studying the Torah is way more important than the state itself. So that would be interesting to see how this social contract between the Hasidic Jews and the state of Israel plays out, if they are now forced to join the military.
They are now, and I think there was like 1,000-man conscription, and only 70 showed up. And then we have seen, obviously, video footage of Israeli security forces beating up on the Haredim community who refuse to fight in the military. Again, the reason this has had to be done is because Israel's short on fighting men, because it has a small population.
So let's finish on this question. I think you mentioned that Israel's on a path to collapse. What can it simply not pull the handbrake? What is it stopping Israel from going down its this path towards its annihilation? As many people I'll quote last week, Itzhak Brick, who was the retired Major General. He said, if we continue fighting in Gaza by raiding and re-raiding the same targets, not only won't we bring Hamas to collapse, but we will collapse ourselves. So top Israeli officials themselves are talking about Israel's collapse. Why can't it simply just pull its handbrake and say, look, let's stop. We see the red lights in front of us, and let's stop now. Why can't it do that?
I think it's a disease of empires and powers on their last legs. They've enjoyed wealth and power for such a long time that generationally they've lost the capability of understanding that you have to actually work at it. You can't just dictate, you can't just bomb, much like the US does. Does the US know how to get out of its war trajectories? I mean, look at how long they were in Afghanistan, and they're still in Iraq. They just simply don't know how to get off losing trajectories, because they're the sort of their lobbies, their political decision-making bodies, their military decision-making bodies, their civilian decision-making bodies in think tanks, et cetera, and foreign interests and dollars paid and corporate lobbies just are too huge to make a sharp turn. It's only the tiniest ever turn, and then they get slapped back into position. Israel's much the same, but Israel also has the most extremist government in the state's very short history. It's something that you can hear in the words of the Israeli coalition that is running Israel today, that genocide is a welcome thing for them, that the extermination of these subhumans in Gaza and the West Bank, oh, if only people weren't looking at us, we'd starve them all out. I mean, these are the words of actual ministers in the Israeli government. So and then they also have this, a little bit of like, their myths and fairy tales have also affected them. They
believe their own propaganda and lies.
Believe their own propaganda, and it's taking them down a suicidal path. They have this story of Masada, how like when we were going to be killed, we to the last man, we fought to the last man, meaning we killed some of the enemy and we all died ourselves, and that is why people worry about things like the Samson option, where Israel is absolutely cornered and its only tool left in its kit box is the nuclear one, even though it knows that it will obliterate the Israeli state and end it. But we're going to kill you all, even if it takes us. And at that point, you imagine that only the extremists will be left in Israel anyways. But there's millions and millions of them. I mean, it's a country that has gone right wing so incredibly fast in such a short history, from almost being socialist in its principles to being absolutely hungry for power and greed. That's basically the fuel that feeds powers and empires on their last legs. And they always make mistakes because they no longer have the foresight, the insights, the philosophies that would have what made them wise ones and made them help them make strategic decisions. They just have the hammer tool now. The more aggressive, the better. So yeah, and I mean, you've seen everybody has piled in, every single head of state with Netanyahu and co has piled in to push for a ceasefire agreement because Israel's allies are losing their appetite 11 months in, right? And Israel keeps escalating, assassinating major officials in the resistance axis in third countries. It's gone nuts. It feels like it's gone nuts, but this is actually, I've argued another piece called with a co-writer of mine, Daniel Namor, that Israel is actually a very rational player. It's always employed something that we call mad strategy, meaning with friends and foes alike, if you act like a mad bull in a china shop once, twice, eventually they just don't want to deal with your situation, and they roll over every time. So, and we gave examples like when Netanyahu visits Joe Biden, then he comes back and launches these assassinations. When Netanyahu visits Vladimir Putin during the Syrian war, he comes back and immediately launches the biggest attack on Syria yet. This is how they train and groom their friends and foes alike to expect and accept bad behavior. But now we argue in this article, for the first time, Israel has an adversary that is willing to respond to each and every salvo. Okay. And it's made the raging bull in the china shop absolutely frothing. It doesn't know how not to win because it's fed itself. We're the chosen ones. We win everything. They're idiots and we can defeat them. And they underestimate the smarts and the capabilities of their adversaries too, which is always good. If you go back to Sun Tzu and stuff, it's always good for your enemy to underestimate you. And so it doesn't know how to get off this speeding train.
Yeah. if your enemy is their own worst enemy, then why stop? Let them
Which is
dig
why
and
you let the
dig and dig
frog
and dig.
boil.
Yeah,
You
that's
let
right.
the frog boil. They will do most of the temperature raising themselves.
Yeah, Sharmine, you gotta go. Thank you so much for joining
No,
us,
it's a
and
pleasure.
I urge everyone who's tuned in to go and watch the full video of her presentation, or Sharmine's presentation, on YouTube. And thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Sharmine, for giving us your thoughts and insights. See you soon for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor.
Definitely. I'd love to be back. Thank you very much, Nassim. Take care.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.